War and Revolution. Chapter 5. The Colonial Tradition, Total War, and Genocide. Section. Total War and Total Manipulation. The particular interest German conservative circles have in shaking off the burden of Auschwitz is understandable. In Franz Josef Strauss's words, Germany must once again become a normal nation and walk with its head held high. The easiest way to achieve this objective is to negate the reality of the genocide. We should not immediately cry scandal. Among the most illustrious casualties of the Second 30 Years' War is truth. Wars have always been accompanied by attempts to defame the enemy and skillful construction of propaganda interwoven with lies. In particular, this is a weapon used against ethnic groups deemed foreign to civilization. Quote, barbarians are branded such by reference to their atrocious practices. In the USA, the more ruthlessly the erasure of Native Americans from the face of the earth proceeded, the more repugnantly they were depicted. Discriminatory wars and wars of annihilation against colonial populations, whether external or internal to the metropolis, were justified by dehumanizing them. And this was achieved by sheer invention of atrocities, or by an inflation and one-sided reading of atrocities actually committed. The legend of ritual murder attributed to Jews for centuries, as evidence of their incorrigible foreignness to civilization as such, can be located in this context. Inasmuch as intensification in the conflicts between civilized peoples involves expulsion of the enemy from the civilized community, a weapon traditionally reserved for the struggle against barbarians is deployed against it. That is how the belligerents in the American Civil War, especially the North, proceeded. But in our century we note a qualitative leap. Along with the industrial mass production of death emerges the industrial mass production of lies and half-truths, intended to criminalize the enemy and destroy his image. The Spanish-American War, which closed the 19th century and inaugurated the 20th, was prepared for ideologically by the USA through the diffusion of news, completely invented, identifying the Spanish as responsible for having killed defenseless prisoners and massacred 300 Cuban women. We witness a further escalation during the First World War. Although undertaken by both sides, the campaign of defamation soon registered the clear prevalence of the Entente. Beginning of long quote. Western allegations of German atrocities began with the violation of Belgian neutrality by the Germans in August 1914. The Germans, it was said, had ravished women and even young children, impaled and crucified men, cut off tongues and breasts, gouged eyes, and burned down whole villages. These reports were not only carried in sensationalist newspapers, but also endorsed by leading writers from John Buchan to Arthur Conan Doyle to Arnold Toynbee, to mention but a few. This propaganda continued throughout 1914 and 15, decreased somewhat in intensity in 1916, but reached a new peak in April 1916 when the British press began to publish news and comments about the use of the corpses of fallen soldiers by the Germans for the production of lubricants such as glycerin and soap. As an afterthought, probably for the benefit of China and the Muslim countries, it was added that pig food was also made of the corpses. There were indeed such installations in Germany, but they were processing animals' cadavers, not human corpses. However, such news items were not the exception. Even highly reputable newspapers such as the Financial Times carried stories according to which the Kaiser himself had ordered the torturing of 3-year-old children and had personally specified what tortures should be applied. The Daily Telegraph reported in March 1916 that the Austrians and the Bulgarians had killed 700,000 Serbs using asphyxiating gas. End of long quote. In the mid-1920s, speaking in the House of Commons, the British Foreign Minister Austen Chamberlain admitted that the story of the corpse factory had been without foundation. Today, we know that the testimony, statements, images, and stills documenting the atrocities of Wilhelmine Germany were the result of skillful manipulation, to which the nascent U.S. cinema industry, shooting scenes in New Jersey of the savage, barbarous behavior of German troops in Belgium, made a splendid contribution. Two details in the atrocities attributed to the Germans give particular pause for thought. The story of women being raped and having their breasts sliced off returns us to the image with which official ideology in America sought to create sexual and racial anxieties about Native Americans. Then there are the crucified men. It is as if the practice of ritual homicide is now being attributed to the Germans. In addition, as early as the First World War, an even more serious suspicion began to hang over them. According to Bergson, as the chosen race, the Germanic race, reserved an absolute right to life, exclusively for itself. At most tolerated in peacetime, the other races were destined to suffer annihilation in wartime. Germany, quote, will not only come to blows with combatants, it will massacre women, children, the elderly. It will sack and burn. The ideal would be to destroy cities, villages, the whole population. End quote. As we can see, the accusation of genocide is deduced here a priori from the ideology attributed to Wilhelmine, eternal Germany. We can now understand the arguments of historical revisionism, or of so-called negationism. Why should the systematic extermination of Jewry attributed to the Third Reich not itself be a myth? Are we dealing with a new, more acute formulation of the charge of ritual murder laid against the Germans, consummated in the Holocaust of a people blessed by the Bible? Let us see who Germany's main accusers were. As a representative of the Wilson administration, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had taken an active part in the campaign against the German atrocities during the First World War. As for Stalin, he even tried at Nuremberg to offload the Soviet execution of Polish officers at Katyn onto the Nazis. Finally, it should be noted that as regards the theme of massacres and genocides, the line of demarcation between historical revisionists and negationists, on the one hand, and historians respectful of the tragedy of the victims, also at the level of historical memory, on the other, is fairly labile and cannot be fixed definitively. We have seen Lacour include in the list of invented atrocities the liquidation of hundreds of thousands of Serbs by poison gas. This would not appear to be the opinion of Hillgruber, even though he is generally counted among the revisionists. While he exculpates the Austrians and pins the blame exclusively on the Eastern Bulgarians, as evidence of the genocidal character that war was already tending to assume in the First World War, Hillgruber records the testimony of a journalist from the Frankfurter Zeitung, released on the 20th of November 1917 by the Secretary of State von Kuhlmann. Quote, "The Serbs are being wiped out, administratively. They are taken for purposes of cleansing to disinfection centers and eliminated by gas." End quote. Even more interesting is the present-day controversy over the Armenian tragedy. In this case, it is descendants of the victims of the Turkish massacres who accuse eminent representatives of international Jewish culture, engaged in demonstrating the uniqueness and incommensurability of the Holocaust, of being negationists or revisionists. Why should it be legitimate to deny or downgrade the Serbian or Armenian genocide, and not the Jewish one? All the more so in that, while Germany has an interest in shaking off the infamy of Auschwitz, rival or potentially rival powers might have an interest in assigning it eternal responsibility for a crime unique in history. To seek to establish an official truth by law, as is the practice in some countries, is contrary to any ethic of scholarly research and, furthermore, can only create suspicions that the victors wish to conceal the truth more stubbornly than they did on the morrow of the First World War. We shall see that historical investigation has no need of external support to document the tragic particularity of the fate reserved for Jewry by Nazism. Perhaps that is why revisionism seems to downgrade the horror of the Third Reich by pursuing a secondary, different strategy. In its initial phase, at any rate, the imprisonment of Jews in German concentration camps was supposedly comparable to that of German citizens in French and British concentration camps, or of American citizens of Japanese origin in American concentration camps. In both cases, this was a measure typical of total war, which does not hesitate to target, en bloc, ethnic groups suspected of a lack of patriotic loyalty. And that Hitler's suspicions were no less legitimate than those harbored by Roosevelt is allegedly demonstrated by the declaration of war on Germany made by Chaim Weizmann in the name of Zionist organizations. Against this thesis, it is pointless proclaiming the innocence of the Jews. This is an argument which obviously applies to American citizens of Japanese origin, particularly since women and children were also confined in the U.S. camps, as it does to the German exiles, most of them anti-fascists, confined in French concentration camps immediately after the outbreak of the war with Germany. As a total institution, the concentration camp involves cancellation of the principle of individual responsibility. And, be it said in their honor, the Jews were not victims who passively waited for the sacrifice to be performed. They often sought to counter the plans of their oppressors and butchers on an international scale. They collaborated with the resistance and were active in the partisan struggle. These are the years when Arendt hoped that Jewish fighters, at war with Nazism since the advent of Hitler, and engaged on all the fronts of the world, would finally unite in an autonomous Jewish army, waging the struggle with its own identity alongside the other armies of the anti-fascist coalition. On the other side, we should not trivialize the fate of Americans of Japanese origin. Bearing in mind the elements of negation and differentiation in comparativism, we can offer a comparison between the two ethnic groups referred to here. Hanging over Americans of Japanese origin was likewise an old racial prejudice, which for decades had warned the white race against the yellow peril, or thundered against the progeny of Asiatic slaves. Accused of never having sought to assimilate to the people receiving them, and remaining obstinately attached to racial solidarity, Americans of Japanese origin, like German Jews, suffered a kind of expropriation. They were forced to sell their goods. There then began a journey into the unknown, which occurred in uncomfortable conditions, sometimes on decrepit, sluggish trains, and lasted up to 10 days. Black shades covered the windows day and night, while controlling the passengers were armed guards who aimed guns at the Japanese Americans. The unfortunates were eventually housed in deserts and swamps, the most desolate, hostile areas of the country, in a further shock to the refugees, most of whom had spent their lives in temperate California. The accommodation, of extremely modest proportions, was not less than 20 miles from the closest small town. The temptation of even more drastic measures arose. We have seen Roosevelt entertain the sterilization of the Japanese proper. The analogy with projects targeting the Jews in Germany once again leaps out at us. The Los Angeles Times thundered menacingly, quote, "A viper is always a viper wherever the egg is hatched. So a Japanese American, born of Japanese parents, grows up to be a Japanese, not an American." End quote. It involved, repeated a general, a race that was much more dangerous than Italian Americans or German Americans. Hence, one could not rest in peace until it had been wiped out. What would have happened in the event of an invasion of U.S. territory, or a genuine threat of invasion? After the Battle of Midway, problems of military security can no longer be invoked. Yet, Americans of Japanese origin continued to be deprived of their liberty. The last of them were only able to leave their concentration camps in mid-1946, almost a year after the end of the Second World War. Even slower was the return home of Latin American citizens of Japanese origin from the USA, deported by 13 Latin American countries. Only in 1948 were the last able to leave the internment or concentration camp of Crystal City in Texas. The effects of the coincidence of total war, which indiscriminately struck ethnic and social groups suspected of insufficient loyalty, with naturalistic despecification, which tended to block any escape route for members of that group, were potentially terrible. Yet we shall see that the comparison suggested by historical revisionism is not convincing, and not only because the temptation to genocide can be more or less strong, more or less deep-seated. However, one cannot simply respond to such comparisons with an indignation that does not deign to enter into the merits of the problem raised. Such is Furet's reaction. On the one hand, he credits Nolte with having, quote, quickly gone beyond the prohibition against putting communism and Nazism in the same bag, end quote, thereby breaking a taboo long widespread in European anti-fascist circles. On the other, he deems both shocking and false the argument in question, which can no doubt be attributed to a basic fund of humiliated German nationalism for which Nolte's adversaries have reproached him for 20 years, and which in large part motivates his books. End quote. It is undeniable that a desire to lessen German culpability plays an important role in the German historian's work. But it is not clear why such motivation should be invoked to liquidate a priori some of his theses, rather than others. Besides, exposure of the psychological or political-social genesis of a particular proposition does not constitute its refutation. Instead, it might be said that for Furet, the hermeneutic of political suspicion renders superfluous a scholarly response to an argument perceived by him as irritating or disturbing. The fact is that, albeit involuntarily and to a limited extent, Nolte has broken a taboo that is much more deeply rooted and much more formidable than the one referred to by the French historian. The latter seems to accept a comparativist approach on condition that it is restricted to comparing the USSR and the Third Reich, without involving the other actors, or the true victors of the Second 30 Years' War. As regards the latter, Nolte himself makes do with a few allusions or the odd rapid sally. This is not attributable to a lack of courage, or even diplomatic caution in conducting an operation intended to result in relativizing or minimizing the horror of the Third Reich, but to the goal of the Red Mission of Germany, thus rehabilitated and rescued from its brief Asiatic parentheses into the sacred heart of the West. There is a further reason. Once the history of the 20th century is depicted as an international civil war lasting until 1989, which saw the various Western countries ranged against the USSR at different times and in different ways, it is clear that the polemic must be focused on the Bolsheviks. And, in fact, according to Nolte, the century's horrors began with the deplorable October 1917. In sum, this is also the view of Furet, who, although stressing the epical character of the turning point of 1914, does so only to point up the constant bellicose frenzy of the likes of Lenin, Mussolini, and Hitler. What is lacking is any examination of the political order which, starting with total mobilization, began to emerge in all the countries engaged in the war. End section.